The air in St. Jude's Cathedral was thick and heavy, saturated with the scent of white lilies and old polished wood. Sunlight struggled through the stained glass windows, casting muted, jewel-toned patterns across the pews, colors too vibrant for the occasion. I sat in the front row, a black veil doing little to hide the genuine devastation on my face. My father-in-law, Arthur Vance, was gone. He had been more of a father to me than my own, a bastion of quiet strength and surprising warmth in the often chilly world of the Vance family. My hand rested on my husband Mark's thigh, a small gesture of support. He was the grieving son, after all. To the outside world, he was the picture of filial sorrow, shoulders slumped, head bowed, a handsome man carved from grief. I felt a surge of love and pity for him. He and his father had a complicated relationship, a constant push and pull of expectation and disappointment, but I knew, deep down, he must be shattered. I squeezed his leg gently. "I'm here, my love," I whispered, my voice thick with tears. He didn't look at me, but he reached over and placed his hand on top of mine, his skin cold as marble. The organ began a low, mournful dirge, the sound vibrating through the floor and up into my bones. Friends of the family, business partners, and distant relatives filed past, their faces a gallery of practiced sympathy. Each murmured condolence. "He was a great man. So sorry for your loss. He's at peace now," felt like a small, sharp stone pelting my already bruised heart. Through it all, I kept my focus on Mark, my husband of 5 years, the man I had vowed to support in sickness and in health, in joy and now, in this profound sorrow. I thought back to our wedding day, how Arthur had pulled me aside, his stern face breaking into a rare, wide smile. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to him, Clara," he'd said, his voice rumbling with emotion. "Keep him honest." At the time, I'd thought it was just a father's fond, slightly gruff blessing. Now, as the eulogies began, each one painting a portrait of the titan of industry and quiet philanthropist I had known, Mark shifted beside me. He leaned in close, his body shielding us from the view of the other mourners. I thought he was finally breaking, that he needed to share a moment of private, unbearable grief with me. I turned my head, ready to offer whatever comfort I could. His breath was warm against my ear, a stark contrast to the chill of his hand. I braced myself for a sob, for a choked whisper of, "I miss him." But the words that slid into my ear were not of sorrow. They were clipped, precise, and drenched in a venom so cold it felt like ice water being poured directly into my soul. "It's finally over," he whispered, his voice a low, triumphant hiss. "The old fool finally kicked the bucket. I've been waiting for this for 10 years. I froze, my entire body going rigid. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Surely I had misheard him. Grief could play tricks on the mind. But he wasn't finished. "The moment that will is read, I'm filing for divorce. Our prenup is ironclad, you know. You get nothing. It was a long performance, but the curtain has finally fallen. Thanks for playing your part." He pulled back, his expression instantly rearranging itself into one of solemn grief for the public eye. But I had seen it, the flash of cruel, triumphant light in his eyes. My blood didn't just run cold, it turned to solid ice in my veins. The world around me dissolved into a meaningless blur of color and sound. The eulogist's voice droned on, but the only words I could hear were the monstrous secret my husband had just confessed. Walking into the Vance mansion for the wake was like stepping into a parallel universe where everything was familiar, yet horribly wrong. The grand foyer, with its sweeping staircase and checkerboard marble floor, was crowded with guests speaking in hushed, respectful tones. Trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres and glasses of champagne circulated, a surreal counterpoint to the grief that was supposed to hang in the air. For me, the grief was real, but it had been horrifically mutated. It was no longer just for Arthur. It was for my life, my marriage, for the 5 years I had dedicated to a man who was a complete and utter stranger. I moved through the rooms in a daze, a ghost at my own funeral. My face felt like a porcelain mask that might crack at any moment. I accepted condolences with automatic nods and murmured, "Thank yous," my voice sounding distant and foreign to my own ears. My eyes kept finding Mark. He was magnificent in his role. He stood by the massive stone fireplace, a glass of whiskey in hand, accepting handshakes and solemn pats on the back. He spoke of his father with a perfectly pitched blend of reverence and sorrow. "He taught me everything I know," he said to one of his father's oldest business associates, his voice catching with feigned emotion. "The company was his life's work. I only hope I can live up to his legacy." A lie. Every word was a polished, calculated lie. I watched him, and my mind became a frantic projector, flashing through memories, recontextualizing them through the horrifying new lens he had provided. The time he'd held me all night after I'd had a miscarriage, whispering that we'd get through it together. Was he secretly relieved? The anniversary trip to Paris he'd surprised me with, which I'd thought was so romantic. Was he just keeping the housewife happy while he waited for his inheritance? Even his arguments with Arthur, which I had always seen as a desperate plea for his father's approval, now looked different. They were the impatient chafing of a predator waiting for its prey to weaken. "Clara, dear, you look so pale." It was Mark's aunt, Martha, her face etched with genuine concern. She squeezed my arm. "This must be so hard on you. You were the daughter Arthur never had." Her kind words were like a dagger. "He knew," a small voice screamed inside my head. Arthur must have known. I offered her a weak, trembling smile. "It is." "Thank you, Martha." I needed to escape. I excused myself, claiming a need for fresh air, and slipped out onto the stone terrace. The cool night air was a shock to my heated skin. Below, the sprawling gardens Arthur had so lovingly tended were cast in shadow. I gripped the cold stone balustrade, my knuckles white. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced by something else, something hot and sharp. Rage. He had not only deceived me, he had used me as a prop in his long, disgusting play. He had made me an unwitting accomplice in his mockery of his own father, the man who had called me daughter, the man who had trusted me to keep him honest. A wave of shame washed over me, so powerful it made me nauseous. But beneath the shame, a tiny, hard ember of resolve began to glow. He would not get away with this. I didn't know how, but I would not let him simply discard me and desecrate Arthur's memory. I would not let him win. The performance wasn't over. He had just given me a new script. I couldn't bear the thought of sleeping in the master suite, in the bed I had shared with a monster. The scent of his cologne on the pillows, the sight of his clothes hanging next to mine in the closet. It would have been unbearable. Instead, I found refuge in one of the mansion's many guest rooms, a space that felt anonymous and blessedly free of shared memories. I locked the door, the click of the bolt a small, satisfying sound in the oppressive silence. The room was opulent, decorated in shades of cream and gold, but it felt like a gilded cage. I didn't bother turning on the main lights, letting the soft glow from a single bedside lamp pool on the floor. For an hour, I just sat on the edge of the bed, my funeral dress still on, staring at the wall. My mind was a maelstrom of panic and fury. He was right about the prenuptial agreement. I had signed it without a second thought, blissfully in love and trusting him completely. It was just a formality, a way to protect the family business, he had said. I had believed him. Now his words echoed in my head. You get nothing. I would be left homeless, penniless, and publicly humiliated. My hands trembled as I pulled a small suitcase from the closet. I had to leave. I couldn't stay under this roof for another night, breathing the same air as him. I began to pack, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. A few items of clothing, my toiletries, the worn copy of Pride and Prejudice Arthur had given me on my first birthday with the family. As I reached for my phone to call for a taxi, it buzzed in my hand, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. My first instinct was to ignore it, to cut off the world entirely. But something compelled me to answer. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Mrs. Vance? Clara? This is George Davison." My breath caught in my throat. George Davison had been Arthur's lawyer and closest confidant for over 40 years. He was a pillar of integrity, a man whose quiet demeanor belied a razor-sharp mind. "Mr. Davison," I managed to say. I'm so sorry for your loss as well. I know you and Arthur were very close. Thank you, my dear. And I for yours, he said, his voice kind, but carrying an unmistakable note of urgency. Clara, I know this is an impossibly difficult time, but I'm calling for a specific reason. Arthur left some private instructions with me, instructions that pertain to you directly and are separate from the main reading of the will. My heart, which had felt like a leaden weight in my chest, gave a hopeful flutter. Instructions? For me? Yes, he continued. He was very clear. I was to contact you personally after the funeral. He asked that you meet with me privately at my office tomorrow morning at 9. It is imperative that you come alone and speak to no one about this meeting, especially not Mark. Do you understand? The emphasis he put on my husband's name was not lost on me. It was a warning. He knew. The thought blazed in my mind again, this time not as a desperate hope, but as a growing certainty. Arthur had known. Yes, I said, my voice suddenly firm, the tremor gone. Yes, Mr. Davison, I understand completely. I'll be there. We hung up, and I sank back onto the bed, my half-packed suitcase forgotten. The dark, suffocating despair that had enveloped me began to recede, pierced by a single brilliant ray of light. I didn't know what Arthur had planned, but for the first time since my world had shattered in that church pew, I felt a flicker of hope. I wasn't powerless. Arthur hadn't abandoned me. The offices of Davison, Finch, and Associates were a sanctuary of old-world dignity. The air smelled of leather-bound books, floor wax, and brewing coffee. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, adorned with framed degrees and discreet landscape paintings. It felt solid, dependable, a world away from the glittering, deceitful facade of the Vance mansion. Mr. Davison greeted me himself, his expression somber but kind. He led me past a hushed reception area into his private office, a corner room with large windows overlooking the city. He closed the heavy oak door behind us, shutting out the rest of the world. Clara, he began, gesturing for me to sit in one of the plush leather armchairs facing his immense desk. Thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy. He sat down and folded his hands on the polished mahogany surface. For 40 years, Arthur was my client and my best friend. I knew him better than anyone, perhaps even better than his own family. He was a brilliant man, but he was not a blind one. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. He loved you, Clara, Mr. Davison said softly. He saw you as the daughter he never had. He also saw the truth of his son. He slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the desk toward me. My name was written on the front in Arthur's familiar, strong handwriting. He wrote this for you about 6 months ago and left it in my care. He asked me to give it to you only under these circumstances. With trembling fingers, I broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. Arthur's words seemed to lift from the page, his voice echoing in my mind. My dearest Clara, it began, his voice echoing. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and I can only hope my passing was peaceful. I must apologize. Not for leaving this world, for that is the path we all must walk, but for what I have put you through. I have long been aware of my son's true nature, his coldness, his insatiable greed. I saw how he looked at you, not with love, but with calculation. I saw how he looked at me, not with respect, but with impatience. I hoped, foolishly, that your genuine love and goodness might be the warmth that could thaw his frozen heart. I was wrong, and for my failure to protect you from him sooner, I am eternally sorry. Tears streamed down my face, blurring the ink. I wasn't crying from sadness, but from a profound sense of validation and love. He had seen me, he had understood. The letter went on to explain his plan. He had restructured his entire estate. The vast majority of his fortune, the liquid assets and company shares Mark was so eagerly awaiting, had been funneled into a newly formed charitable trust, the Arthur Vance Foundation for Arts and Education, his true legacy. And, in a move that made me gasp, he had named me the sole executor and chairwoman of the board, giving me absolute controlling interest in the company he had built. He trusted you to protect his legacy from the one person he knew would destroy it, Mr. Davison said, his voice gentle. He then produced a small, ornate brass key. This is for a safe deposit box. It contains documents Arthur compiled over the last few years, evidence of Mark's financial indiscretions against the company, forgeries, unauthorized expenditures. Arthur knew, but he was waiting. He said he was giving you the sword and the shield. This key is the sword. I clutched the letter and the key to my chest. The grief for Arthur was a deep, aching void, but it was now mingled with a fierce, burning purpose. I was no longer a victim on the verge of being cast aside. I was Arthur's chosen successor, his avenging angel. I returned to the mansion not as a frightened mouse ready to flee, but as a queen returning to her castle to survey her domain. The house was quiet now, the guests gone, the staff moving silently as they cleared away the last vestiges of the wake. I found Mark in the library, standing before the unlit fireplace, swirling a glass of amber liquid. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, ready for the will reading that was scheduled for noon. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He probably assumed I had spent the night crying in the guest room. He gave me a look of bored impatience, the mask of the grieving son now completely gone, replaced by the cold, dismissive man he truly was. "There you are," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I see you haven't packed your things and left yet. Don't drag this out, Clara. It's unseemly." He took a sip of his drink, his eyes scanning me with detached appraisal, as if I were a piece of furniture he was about to have hauled away. The old me, the Clara from 24 hours ago, would have shrunk under that gaze. She would have pleaded or cried or simply withered in silence. But I was not her anymore. I walked calmly into the room, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. I stopped a few feet from him, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm not going anywhere, Mark," I said, my voice even and steady. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Don't be difficult. The prenup is airtight. George Davison is a shark. You don't stand a chance of contesting it. You signed away any claim to the Vance fortune. You'll get the settlement we agreed upon and not a penny more. Be grateful for that." "Oh, I'm not interested in the Vance fortune," I replied, allowing a small, knowing smile to touch my lips. "I'm more interested in Arthur's legacy. You know, the things he actually cared about." This seemed to confuse him. He narrowed his eyes, searching my face for the familiar weakness he was used to exploiting. He found none. He saw only a calm, unreadable strength. It was like a chess player realizing his opponent was no longer making the moves he'd anticipated. "What are you talking about?" he scoffed, though there was a new edge of uncertainty in his tone. "His legacy is the fortune. It's the company. And it's all mine, as it should be." He drained his glass and set it down with a sharp click. "Get whatever you want to take from the house. I want you gone by the end of the day. Our little arrangement is over." "Our arrangement," I repeated softly, tasting the bitter words. "Yes, I suppose it is, but I don't think you'll be giving the orders in this house for much longer." I turned and walked toward the door, leaving him standing there, a storm brewing behind his eyes. "We'll see what your father had to say about all this, Mark. I think you'll find he was a man of many surprises." For the first time, I saw a genuine flicker of unease, a crack in his armor of supreme arrogance. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew something had changed. The game had changed, and he was no longer in control. The thought gave me a cold, satisfying thrill. The storm was coming, and I was ready to be the lightning. The boardroom at Mr. Davison's law firm was just as imposing as his office. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by 20 leather chairs. The mood was a cocktail of solemnity and barely concealed anticipation. I sat on one side of the table, composed and silent. Across from me sat Mark, flanked by his Aunt Martha and Uncle Robert, who looked on with nervous expectation. A few of the company's senior board members were present, their faces grim and professional. Mark, however, had shed the slight unease from our earlier encounter. He was back to his smug, confident self, leaning back in his chair as if he were already sitting on a throne. He caught my eye and gave me a minuscule, mocking smirk that said, "Enjoy your last few moments of relevance." I simply held his gaze, my expression serene. He had no idea he was a condemned man waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. Mr. Davison entered the room, carrying a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He took his seat at the head of the table, adjusted his glasses, and cleared his throat. The room fell silent. "We are gathered today," he began in his formal, measured tone, "for the reading of the last will and testament of Arthur James Vance." He started with the minor bequests: testament of a valuable painting to a museum, a generous donation to the local university, specific heirlooms to his sister, Martha, and brother, Robert. With each item read, the tension in the room coiled tighter. Mark sat forward, his smirk replaced by a look of intense focus. This was the preamble, the opening act before the main event he had been waiting for his entire adult life. "Now," Mr. Davison said, pausing to look pointedly around the room, "we come to the disposition of the main body of the estate, including all liquid assets, property holdings, and Mr. Vance's controlling shares in Vance Industries." Mark physically straightened his tie, a preening gesture of victory. This was his moment. Mr. Davison continued reading from the document. "I, Arthur James Vance, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my remaining financial estate, including all stocks, bonds, and capital, to a charitable trust, established for the betterment of our community." A collective, quiet gasp went through the room. Mark's face went slack with shock, his jaw literally dropping open. "This entity," Mr. Davison read on, his voice ringing with authority, "shall be known as the Arthur Vance Foundation for Arts and Education." Mark looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. He was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. But the final, killing blow was yet to come. "As founder of this trust," Mr. Davison announced, his eyes lifting from the page to look directly at me, "Arthur Vance has appointed a sole executor and permanent chairwoman of the board, who will hold full proxy and voting power over all of Vance Industries' controlling shares." He paused for dramatic effect. The silence was absolute. "He has entrusted this responsibility, his life's work, and his enduring legacy, to his beloved daughter-in-law, Clara Ann Vance." The sound that escaped Mark's lips was a strangled gasp. Every head in the room swiveled to look at me. I did not smile. I simply met my husband's horrified, hate-filled gaze with cool, unwavering calm. The curtain had indeed fallen, just as he'd said. But it was on his world, not mine. The boardroom erupted, not in noise, but in a sudden, sharp intake of breath from everyone present. The silence that followed was thick with shock and disbelief. But it was Mark who broke it, his voice a raw, ugly tear in the fabric of the moment. "No!" he shouted, slamming his fist on the table, making the water glasses jump. "That's impossible! It's a forgery! She manipulated him! The old man was senile! He didn't know what he was signing!" He shot to his feet, his face a mottled mask of crimson and white. His eyes, burning with a furious, cornered animal panic, locked onto me. "You did this!" he spat, pointing a trembling finger across the table. "You snake! You poisoned him against his own son." The board members shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting between Mark's unhinged outburst and my utter stillness. Aunt Martha looked horrified, her hand flying to her mouth. This was the moment. The public confrontation. The stage Arthur had so carefully set for me. I rose slowly from my chair, my movements deliberate and calm. I felt a strange serenity settle over me, the clarity that comes when fear has been burned away by purpose. "He wasn't senile, Mark," I said, my voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. "He was just a better judge of character than you ever gave him credit for. He knew exactly who you were. He knew you were a greedy, heartless man who saw your own father as a walking bank account and your wife as a temporary inconvenience." Mark opened his mouth to retort, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned my attention to Mr. Davison. "Mr. Davison," I said formally, "I believe you have some other documents Arthur wished to be made public at this time?" The lawyer nodded gravely. He opened a separate file folder and began distributing copies of its contents to the stunned board members. These documents, Mr. Davison explained, were compiled by Arthur Vance himself over the past 18 months. They are records of unauthorized fund transfers, falsified expense reports, and back-channel deals that diverted company profits into a private offshore account. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. An account held by Mr. Mark Vance. A wave of murmurs swept through the room as the board members scanned the damning evidence. Mark's rage evaporated, replaced by the ashen, sickly pallor of absolute ruin. He sank back into his chair, looking utterly defeated. "Your father knew you were stealing from him, Mark," I continued, my voice now devoid of all emotion except a cold, hard finality. "He knew you were a cancer in the company he spent his life building. He didn't want his legacy to be money. He wanted it to be integrity, creativity, and community. A legacy you would have auctioned off to the highest bidder." I turned to the board, my new board. As my first official act as chairwoman of the Arthur Vance Foundation, and therefore the majority shareholder of this company, I'm calling for an immediate and full forensic audit of the last 5 years of our finances. And I am seconding the motion I'm sure you are all considering, the immediate termination of Mark Vance's employment, for cause. There was a beat of silence, and then the senior board member, a man named Harris, looked up from the papers, his face, like granite. "Man named Harris." "Motion carried," he said. It was done. Mark didn't scream or rage. He just sat there, a hollowed-out man, publicly and completely destroyed by the father he had scorned and the wife he had underestimated. 3 weeks later, I sat behind the great mahogany desk in Arthur's study. It no longer felt like his study, a place I had only ever entered as a guest. Now it was mine. The scent of his pipe tobacco had faded, replaced by the faintest hint of the jasmine perfume I wore. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and warming the rich leather of the chair. On the desk in front of me were not trinkets or photo albums, but quarterly reports, foundation proposals, and legal briefings from Mr. Davison. The whirlwind of the past few weeks had been overwhelming, but in a way that was bracing rather than draining. Mark was gone. The divorce was being finalized, a swift and brutal severing. He was facing a litany of charges from the board, and his social and professional ruin was absolute. He had vanished from the world we once shared, a ghost haunted by his own greed. I felt no triumph in his downfall, only a quiet, somber sense of justice fulfilled. My victory wasn't over him. It was for Arthur. I picked up a proposal for a new youth arts scholarship, one of the first initiatives of the Arthur Vance Foundation. As I read through the details, a genuine smile touched my lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. This was real. This was meaningful. This was the legacy Arthur had entrusted to me. Not a pile of money, but an engine for good. The ache of Mark's betrayal was still there, a thin, silvery scar on my heart. A 5-year illusion is not easily dismissed. I would sometimes catch myself thinking of a shared joke or a past tenderness, and a pang of the old life would strike me. But it was fleeting, the phantom pain of an amputated limb. It was being replaced by something stronger, something I was building myself, from the foundations Arthur had left me. I looked out the window, over the sprawling gardens that were now bursting with late spring color. I missed Arthur with a depth that still took my breath away, but I no longer felt only grief when I thought of him. I felt gratitude. He had seen the strength in me that I hadn't known I possessed. He hadn't just saved me from ruin, he had given me a purpose. My phone rang. It was Mr. Davison checking in. We spoke for a few minutes about foundation business, our conversation easy and professional. I was no longer the frightened, weeping woman who had come to his office in desperation. I was the chairwoman. I was a leader. When we hung up, I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the sun wash over my face. The house was quiet, but it was not empty. It was filled with potential, with the promise of a future I would write on my own terms. The performance was well and truly over, and for the first time, I felt free. I was Clara Vance, no longer defined by the man whose name I carried, but by the legacy I now commanded. And it was a good legacy. It was a life.